I have a privilege and honor to introduce my good friend, colleague, distinguished diplomat Einar Gunnarsson, who is representing Iceland to the United Nations, and currently, during this session, he's chairing the third committee. In the United Nations family, it is very rare when ambassador so easily takes this chair, very dangerous chair, to protect human rights. That's why, if there is a choice, well, ambassadors, they're trying to take something more easy, like disarmament, for example, or even fifth committee, budget, or sixth committee. So I did sixth committee. So it's very courageous to take this post. But for Ambassador Gunnarsson, it's not something new. His country is a leader in human rights protection. That's why for him it's easy to understand the main tendencies, flows, and contradictions. So today we will speak about contradiction as well. All these difficulties between universality of human rights and particularity, diversity, and how it works or doesn't work in the United Nations system. It's very interesting. Some of the students here, they were following your presidency there. We applauded in many occasions. So that's why welcome to Yale family. And please start, and then we will ask you.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Sergeyev, because once an ambassador, always an ambassador. So you will never get rid of your past in this business.
True.
First of all, I'm honored to be here with you at Yale, the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies. I am here, of course, in my capacity as the permanent representative of Iceland. However, I just want to make the usual disclaimer that today I will be speaking in my personal capacity and not formally representing the third committee of the General Assembly of the United Nations, nor my government, the government of Iceland. But of course, I'm speaking from the experiences that I have from both roles, but just want to make this usual disclaimer about not binding anybody else than myself for what I'm going to say here. The opinions and views are mine and mine only, and all the errors I will make, and I'm sure I will make a few, because I'm certainly not an expert. That is the life of a diplomat. We can rarely be experts on the things that we're working on. We're rather generalists dealing with these things. So the errors that I will certainly make, they will all be the sole responsibility of mine, and I trust that all of you will be happy, more than happy, to correct me whenever I put my foot wrong during this time that I have with you here this afternoon. Now, as Sergeyev said, Iceland had the pleasure of chairing the third committee of the General Assembly of the UN this fall in the 72nd session. It's a year-long responsibility lasting from September this year till September next year. And it's only the second time that Iceland has undertaken this responsibility of chairing one of the main committees of the UN General Assembly. And the last time we did so was more than 50 years ago, if I'm correct. However, the work of the third committee is concentrated on 8 weeks from beginning of October until Thanksgiving every year. So I will, even though I will continue to serve as the chair of the committee, it is unlikely that I will see many more meetings outside now after Thanksgiving. The third committee is indeed a very interesting committee. It was initially the committee dealing with human rights. It was the body within the international system or the UN family dealing with human rights. From the beginning, we had the third committee of the General Assembly and the Commission on Human Rights. And just to put this into perspective, if I'm correct, actually the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights was actually dealt with through the third committee, adopted there, and from there sent on to the General Assembly for proper adoption. Today, the third committee is a part of a much larger system of human rights mechanisms. From the Human Rights Council in Geneva, with its Universal Periodic Review, or the UPR, and its special mandate holders. We can also name the regional conventions and commissions, the human rights treaty body system, of course various other fora that are dealing with human rights. The third committee is served by a standing secretariat in the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, a very valuable support to the work that one has. And as I was sitting at the podium in October and November, for most of the meetings I had the very positive security feeling of having a representative from the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights sitting at my right-hand side throughout most of the proceedings. The third committee has one, let's say, particularity within all of these bodies I was referring to, and that is that it is the only forum that has universal membership discussing human rights, humanitarian and social issues, and that makes it a very important norm-setting body. And in that sense, we can draw a distinction between the third committee and most other bodies that are dealing with human rights. One could probably say that the third committee should be sort of the body that would be contemplating new ideas, preparatory work for any kind of new human rights conventions or establishing new norms, while it might also be sensible, at least to a simple lawyer like myself, to see many of the other bodies more concerned with the operative part of the system, clearly as is embodied in, for example, in the UPR processes of the Human Rights Council. Now, there is an overlap. We see the third committee starting to dealing with specific situations, as I will address a little bit further, more further on, and also we can see other bodies venturing into the normative side of things, not dealing with specific situations, but rather addressing in more general terms the norms that should apply. However, when that happens on the normative side in other bodies, then we have this lack of universal membership. So I think this is maybe the one of the most important sort of sides to draw your attention to, the universal membership of the third committee. And it can also be an explanation why we still need the third committee after we have the Human Rights Council established 10 years ago. There is this fundamental difference between the composition of the Human Rights Council and that of the third committee. Now, during this session, we saw the same 12 agenda items allocated to the third committee as usually, concerning a wide range of social, humanitarian and human rights issues. We also saw a record number of special mandate holders interacting with the committee, and over 60 resolutions that were adopted in the committee. And basically you can divide the work of the third committee into three categories. We deal with these special mandate holders through these interactive dialogues, and basically they are organized in such a manner that we set aside 1 hour for each interactive dialogue. They take place under a mandate that is usually provided for by the Human Rights Council. It is a special rapporteur on this or that issue that is working in this general capacity and is mandated to report back to the General Assembly, which is done through the third committee, and to the Human Rights Council. There are a little bit of variations, but this would be sort of the general description. And we set aside 1 hour for each of these special mandate holders. They come in, they make an introduction. The member states will then have the possibility to make comments or pose questions to them, and the special rapporteur, he or she, they will be given the possibility towards the end to respond to the questions and comments made. We schedule 3 of them in one meeting slot, which lasts 3 hours. And so it should come as no surprise that this can be quite challenging to provide for a substantive discussion with 193 member states and one special mandate holder within 1 hour, especially as we don't know at the outset how many we have. So we have to run a very strict protocol there with automatic cut-off of microphones and adjustment of speaking times. We anticipate at the beginning that we would be able to give every country that would want to pose a question or make a comment 3 minutes to do so. But given the reality of the clock and when we see how many requests we have for the floor, we sometimes have to revert to cutting down these times down to as little as 1 minute per delegation. So this takes up quite a considerable part of the time at the beginning. Maybe I would say that this, along with the general discussions, which I will refer to a little bit afterwards, they take up 2/3 of the time. The general discussions are organized so that we cluster these 12 agenda items into 7 debates. And in those debates, they are topical, and then the member states can make intervention or statements on these topics. And the third category in the work is the resolutions. And they come towards the end of this 8 weeks, 60 or 64, I think 64 of have we had this year, and they are again topical, dealing with many of the same issues as before. Now, and of course, at the end, the resolutions that the committee is adopting, they are either adopted by consensus. About 2/3 of them, of these 60 or a little bit more than 60 resolutions are adopted by consensus, and the rest is voted upon. Just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what we are dealing with, I would just like to mention a couple of examples. on one of the first agenda items, the social development. We had this year two interesting topics, one on dealing with the family, resolution on the family, and another one on aging. And the family resolution, after having not been submitted for last year, it was submitted again now by the group of 77. And sometimes these resolutions or the debates about them, they can start to revolve about very minor things to the untrained eye. Sometimes revolve around commas or words. And when it comes to the family resolution, it can even start to revolve around a tense of word. Or would anyone in this group be able to explain why one group of countries would prefer to say the family, while another group would insist on saying families in plural? At the moment, we have a little bit of truce on this topic, being able to agree upon a neutral language, avoiding this term of family. And we have seen a similar process at the Commission of Status of Women, where we have had a clash between some delegations proposing some very traditional, some would even say conservative language on the family, while others have wanted to go with a much more, let's say, progressive wording. And this, of course, if there would be anyone in this room that is not seeing what it is all about, it's about whether we are only talking about the traditional nucleus family of a man and a wife and with some children, or rather recognizing that there are diverse composition of families around the world and in different societies. The other resolution I mentioned, the one on aging, Argentina is the one who has to lead there, and they are trying to build a consensus for future action on addressing the human rights of older persons, whether that might be through a treaty or an optional protocol, despite questions from other delegations if more treaties are needed. Both of these resolutions were adopted by consensus this year, but I think this is the it's a good opportunity to point out to the nature of the work of the Third Committee and the General Assembly in general, and that is that the resolutions that are being adopted by the General Assembly, they are not binding, they are not treaties, they are not they do not impose obligations upon member states in the same ways as when we are negotiating multilateral treaties. However, at the same time, they are often precursors to such treaty making later on. And this also means that one could say that resolutions of the General Assembly are only as important as they are, meaning that if they are generally recognized, they can actually have quite a strong effect on member states and on general thinking about what is accepted or preferable. If they are, on the other hand, highly contested, that value might be diminished, but could still be important in let's say, fighting for a new cause or defending some kind of an ideal or principle that people are working on. But in that sense, then because many of them are recurrent, then it starts to matter a lot whether you see increased support or decreased support from one year to another. Under the agenda item on the advancement of women, we had only one text, that was the text of the committee itself, submitted by me in my capacity as the chair, on the follow-up to the Beijing Platform for Action on Gender Equality. As usually, this was adopted by consensus, but one little element that was added there was a strong wording to reinforce the support of member states to the Secretary General on his gender parity plan. And I just mentioned this to draw your attention to the effect of these resolutions. They may not only relate to member states or what is happening in member states. They can also relate to the interplay between the member states and the UN system or the secretariat, what to do, how to do it. And on this particular one could question what came first. Was it the wish of the Secretary General to get support from member states on his plan on gender parity in higher positions within the UN system, or is it is the driving force a wish from the member states to impose on the Secretary General some discipline in this respect? This year, probably the most challenging item was on the rights of the child, with two texts on the girl child and the rights of the child being some of the last to be adopted, with the topic of violence against children causing quite a controversy. Questions relating to corporal punishment and the role of parents were key topics, and with the issue of sex education being the cause of multiple amendment proposals. And finally, I would say that a significant part of the work of the committee was held under the agenda item of promotion and protection of human rights, where the majority of proposals, including the so-called country-specific resolutions, were discussed. Now, these country-specific or country-specifics, as we call them, are a very interesting component of the work of the third committee, as they relate to the situation of human rights in specific countries, while the other texts relate more to the specific themes and rights. And there again, I come to what I mentioned earlier, this sort of blurred line between the normative side of the role of the third committee and the more operative side, for example, of the Human Rights Council. There we can clearly see that the third committee is actually dwelling more into sort of particular situations, less on the normative side, and trying to influence what is happening on the ground in a particular country. The relevance and role of this country-specific resolution is hotly debated, as the resolutions themselves. Now we have situations in Syria, Iran and Crimea being discussed, and I would say quite many saying that these resolutions are an important part of our work to advance human rights in countries where we are dealing with some of the worst situations. But then again, we should not forget, that the Human Rights Council is dealing with this every day, and they are dealing with vastly more situations. We had this year again also a text on Myanmar, after it having been dropped for the last session. Now it was introduced by the Organization of Islamic States, coming together to submit a text to respond to the Rohingya crisis. This text it could be claimed that on its own it might not have carried much weight, but when it is seen as a part of efforts by many others, both individual states and the rest of the UN system, I have heard quite strong testimony from people working on the ground in Myanmar, where they claim these to have a significant impact on the ground, and helping those that are trying to work on the ground in order to improve situation there, helping them a lot. But the most important question when it comes to these is how do countries get selected for country-specific resolutions, in particular in the third committee? Why do we not have a resolution on Iceland or Saudi Arabia or the host country, the United States? It is clearly so when we look at the debate on these country-specific resolutions and the interactive dialogues on country-specific situations in the third committee, that there is a sizable majority of member states that is of the opinion that they are an important tool to try to have positive effect on human rights situations in these particular countries or regions. However, and I would say this is a very sizable majority, however, maybe a little bit silent one. There is also a considerable number of member states, clearly a minority, but a considerable minority nevertheless, which is very vocal about their questions about the motivation behind these country-specific resolutions and procedures, believing that they are quite politicized and are being used for political purposes in a manner that is can be, from their perspective, seen as arbitrary. Why this country or not that country is being subjected to this process. So when we are working on these issues, we also have the tendency to see strong emotions. Delegates sometimes can get quite emotional. We see a lot of delegates reverting to using their possibilities under the rules of procedures to either make replies to comments made by other delegations or complaining about the management of the meeting. Being a chair under these in this situation means that you have to be awake for the whole time and be ready to deal with a point of order, whether you are conducting the meeting in the right and proper manner. It's extremely important during these kind of debates to keep order, to be non-partial, to make sure that those countries that are being put on the spot, they are treated with respect, because the first thing that goes out of the window if you lose that is the substance. If there's a flare-up in a meeting like this and people start shouting at each other, as has happened, the first thing that will suffer will be the important substance matter that we are dealing with, which is human rights of people on the ground. So it's always important to be able to keep control. I would also like to mention one more text It was the text submitted by Norway on human rights defenders. It's a traditional text on the important role of individuals that work on the ground for human rights. It has been adopted regularly at the UN with consensus for several for a long time, but last time it came up 2 years ago, it actually was voted on, and we saw, in my opinion, a very welcome reversal of that, where delegations were actually able to come again to a consensus on this text and avoid having it voted upon. And the reason I say this is welcome is that when you are working on issues like we are working with in the third committee, we actually have to think about consensus and why we are so preoccupied with consensus when we are working at the UN. Now, it is clearly so that it is the right of any member state to call for a vote on whatever resolution they want, and nobody should question that right, and sometimes it may be important and sometimes you might want to do it. But when we are dealing with soft law, when we are dealing with something that has, as I said, as much effect as it has, then consensus can become the most important tool that you have in order to advance whatever you are trying to advance, or in order to fight against whatever you are fighting against. Because consensus is hard and voting is easy. It's very easy if you disagree with something just to say I'm going to call for a vote. When you are working with the consensus, you are trying to influence people into some kind of an agreement on the middle. And when you do that, it can very easily be claimed that you are selling out. You're selling out on whatever ideal or cause that you have close to your heart, that you are trying to advance or defend. But the reality is that when you don't have a binding outcome, the value of the outcome is only as much as those that walk away from the outcome give to it. So when you are negotiating in the UN on a consensus, you sometimes have to give something, but what you can gain is a result that will actually enjoy wide recognition as being something that everybody should adhere to. And that is the reason that consensus is one of the most important tools that we have. This year we saw one big member state, very big member state, reverting to calling for votes on several more items than usually. And as I said earlier, it is absolutely clearly the right of any member state to do so. But when you see the results of these votes coming out, maybe so that the one who called for a vote is absolutely isolated, being alone, maybe against the rest of the membership, then you can start to at least wonder about why you do that. And I'm not saying that there cannot be good justifications to it. There may very well be. Sometimes principle is of paramount importance, and you should actually stick to your principles. But if you are trying to use this process to influence others to do something that you want them to do, or not to do something you don't want them to do, then it can be questioned how much value there is in calling for a vote and then ended up being in either alone or in a very, very small minority of those that have the same view as you. Finally, I would like to address a little bit another interesting development that we have seen in the last few years, which is stronger engagement by China. It was, in the past, it has been claimed that China was not very vocal in the work of the Third Committee, for example. We have seen some changes to this. For the 2 years ago, we saw them requesting a vote for the first time in our knowledge in the Third Committee. And last summer, they presented their first resolution in the Human Rights Council on Development and Human Rights. And you have certainly heard claims that the Chinese approach may be somewhat of a hierarchy of rights, emphasizes on development and economic and social rights, such as right to food and water, housing, etc. There are some that are skeptical to this approach. I have heard some classifying this as being a promotion of an alternative to the universality of human rights. Others have used the words human rights with a Chinese touch. And it very much touches upon this conversation about whether human rights are truly universal or if they are dependent on the country situation. Now, I'm not going to give any kind of final sort of answer to all of these issues, but I must only say that from my perspective, having been sitting up at the podium chairing the Third Committee, I actually believe that it is very important that we see strong engagement from the biggest member state of the UN in terms of number of people, and a country that everyone believes will be ever more influential in the multilateral fora in this century that we have just started. I think actually we should not see that as any kind of incitement to any kind of complacency when it comes to things that we hold dear, like universality of human rights, but we have to be able to engage with those that might have different approaches that we have, and if we fear that they might be promoting something that we do not agree with, we simply have to work harder on our argumentation for what we believe in. So just again, from the perspective of being in the chair of the Third Committee, I absolutely believe in the importance of everybody participating, and not only those that may share exactly the same approach or same views on things. So in that sense, I find it highly welcoming, but it clearly poses some challenges when you have more interactions, more stronger views on what we are dealing with, coming from new angles or different angles than before. And of course, it will request a lot from everybody participating in this. However, in that, I also say, as diplomat, how important I believe it is that we take time to try to understand where people are coming from. And I think it is most important trying to understand those that we disagree with. It's not so difficult with, you know, my closest neighbor. You know, I come from Iceland. It's not so important that I understand my friends from Scandinavia, you know, the Norwegians, Swedes, and you know, Denmark, Finland better. I understand them pretty well. The further away people are, the more different opinions they have, the more important it is to understand them. And understanding does not mean agreeing. So there is a fundamental difference between those two things. And I sometimes wonder whether people are doing enough in terms of trying to understand what they are dealing with. So the question might be then, can the UN efficiently protect human rights? And for me, that question goes back to the fundamental question of what the UN is. The UN is not an immaculate conception. It is made by us, for us. And as Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General of the United Nations, once said, do we refer to the purposes of the Charter? They are expressions of universally shared ideals which cannot fail us, though we, alas, often fail them. Or do we think of the institutions of the United Nations? They are our tools. We fashioned them. We use them. It is our responsibility to remedy any flaws there may be in them. This is a difficult lesson for both idealists and realists, though for different reasons. I suppose that just as the first temptation of the realist is the illusion of cynicism, so the first temptation of the idealist is the illusion of utopia. And I think Dag Hammarskjöld said this talking to the International Law Association at McGill University in 1956. And I believe that it is therefore upon all of us, through our governments, to protect human rights, and that without us, the UN cannot be expected to do much. So with this, I would hope that you would take charge and make me suffer and try to find out my weak spots. For example, finding out that even though I sat there up at the podium for these 8 weeks and had going through my table probably some thousands of pages of reports and resolutions and other stuff, I hope that you will clearly not ask me whether I read all of them, but over to you.
Thank you, Ambassador Gunnarsson. Thank you for a very informative, comprehensive sharing what you did, what the Third Committee is doing, what the United Nations is doing. So you mentioned several country-specific resolutions. Among them, they are coming back to that committee annually. So it's predictable, any kind of discussions, even we know who is going to use the right to reply.
Yes.
Before the meeting starts. People, they don't like this kind of resolution. They do not like to mention any problems of the member states. That's why they are fighting to have generally these specific resolutions in the Third Committee, demanding that we have the periodic reviews in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, why we are bringing these issues. So, and all these meetings around these resolutions are very tough. Tough language, ping-ponging, and so on. And that's why I was positively surprised when at the last meeting you had the Syrian representative. Thank you very much for your kind generosity and good management of these particular issues. It never happened in my time of being there. So you did the job well if they are satisfied with that. But the reality is that next year we are going to celebrate the 70th anniversary of Universal Human Rights Declaration. And this, not only this document, but the Charter, United Nations Charter, is being questioned. Declaration is declaration, and people, they are interpreting the provisions in the way they want to interpret it. You mentioned one of the countries who selectively approaches to the understanding of human rights, taking only economic or social aspect of the rights, when the human rights are universal, indivisible, and there is an integrity. Some of the countries with the specific resolutions, they are claiming that, look, we are blaming us because of violation of the rights of assembly, but we are so great in protection of rights to health, rights to education. So this is exactly about the integrity of human rights, indivisibility. So, and if a problem is revealed, it doesn't mean a blame. So interpretation of the basic documents of the United Nations is very important. For me, it's interesting how you conducted the meeting on, for example, self-determination of nations, because, and particularly in the year when we have a lot of the challenges in Catalonia, well, in Mali, and anywhere. My reading was what happened, for example, in Crimea, when the rights of the Russian-speaking population was announced as the legal base for intervention to protect them. So this manipulation of one of the major provisions of the Charter, challenging other provision, territorial integrity. Interesting how people would, this year discussed this resolution of self-determination. This is one of my questions. Of course, what I have been observing since 2007 when I appeared there, so the conflict between the right to choice and the right to protect traditions. Traditions and liberalism are conflicting around many issues in the United Nations, including Third Committee. Well, so my major question is that we need, preparing for the 70th anniversary of Human Rights Declaration, we need to speak more about our responsibility of reading the basic documents, which are being read by some of the countries voluntarily and using what is today is useful politically for them or for their interests.
Yes, you clearly picked up on one of the very important underlying issues. I mean, one could clearly feel when dealing with these issues this year around that there are a lot of questions coming up. We, of course, see the situation in Crimea, where majority of member states clearly see it as a territorial question and clearly see Crimea as being under occupation or not having been taken from under the control of the rightful authorities. And at the same time, we see what is happening in Catalonia. We see the current discussions between the UK and the European Union coming almost to a standoff over the issue of Northern Ireland, and looming in the background is the issue of Gibraltar, and we see in the Middle East we see the issue of the Kurds in covering several countries there. We could see regular flare-up of emotions in the committee between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So I think you have clearly pointed out to one of the most challenging questions. And it's challenging because for a long time it was maybe being approached rather easily with a very strong focus from one direction, which was the question about self-determination, and sort of the tide was flowing into the same direction. Now we see that these types of questions can come up in maybe much more complex setting that we were thinking about in the last 60 to 70 years. So I certainly believe that this will be very strong on the agenda in the coming years, and I don't think we have seen the last of it. In terms of country specifics, it's also worth to mention, that because I was referring to the sensitivity of those countries that are being subject to these country-specific resolutions. But of course, when we talk about Crimea or Ukraine, it is Ukraine that is actually bringing forward the resolution. So it does not necessarily have to be in this one-sided reality that you have a country that feels it being subjected to some kind of undue pressure by the outside world. It can also be the other way around, where one country decides to use these venues to take up their particular issues. And I also think when we look at these debates, I tried to point at it before, you have to be ready to look a little bit under the surface. When we look at the country-specific dialogues, whether it was on the resolutions or in the interactive dialogues, if you would only listen to what is being said, you would probably come to the conclusion that the overwhelming majority of the member states were extremely much against this. And that is what I was referring to when I was talking about the silent majority. Clearly the majority is of the opinion that these resolutions, these dialogues, can be important and powerful tools to improve the situation on the ground, to try to affect behavior of certain member states, maybe the concerned member state or some other member states that have particular stake. But nevertheless, I also believe that we have to ask ourselves as member states, why are we doing things? What is our objective? Because we can have different objectives. Sometimes we do things because it's good for us back at home. Sometimes we do things because we believe it has some particular effect within that particular country. I must say, sitting at the podium and listening to those countries that were very vocal about their objections to these types of procedures, I could not really hear from them that they were sending out any signals that they were going to change their opinion or behavior. But I heard one thing. They were all very strong in proclaiming their affection for the UPR of the Human Rights Council. Mm-hmm. And I'm not absolutely sure that they would all be so happy about the UPR of the Human Rights Council if they would not have been dealing with that. But it's just a theory of mine.
Yeah.
The other question.
Many interesting developments when we are looking who is the main reporters or co-sponsor of some country-specific resolution. For example, Syria.
Yes.
For you to be interesting, who brought this resolution on the violation of human rights in Syria? Saudi Arabia. Very interesting. So the Arab world is changing as well, despite the fact that Arab world invented the parallel declaration, so-called Cairo Declaration. Well, there are some developments, and I agree that even this kind of the dialogue and the process very important when people they are understanding the universality of human rights more and more in different regions. But the truth is that the United Nations was invented to protect and to defend people and people's human rights. But we can't stop the perpetrators. We can't. We are detecting problems. We are telling broadly about what is going on in Myanmar. Well, so they are rejecting any accusations, telling that they are terrorists. All these almost 600,000 people, they are terrorists, and so we can't stop them. That is why I don't know if it exists, this group or not. But in my time, it was a group of ambassadors led by the Liechtenstein ambassador, demanding the same mechanism of sanctions for the Human Rights Council in Geneva as the Security Council has in New York. But hardly the P5 in New York are ready to share this mechanism. So it means that there is no mechanism how to stop the perpetrators from the very beginning. Then we don't have exact mechanisms except the special tribunals, like for Yugoslavia and so on, well, to bring the perpetrators to justice. The only body is ICC, but it is not a universal mechanism. It's,
and it's under attack.
Yeah. It's true. So some African countries, they hate ICC when it is about the violation of human rights in their countries. So it is true. It is one of the biggest gaps in the United Nations system, that there is no efficient mechanism how to stop the perpetrators at the beginning. Well, if you want to join discussion with your questions, so of course the universality and diversity. It's a very important question. Either universality versus diversion or diversion versus universality. What we have to speak more in the United Nations about what is uniting us, or to understand our differences, and then well to find better language. So this is the question. Please.
Yeah, sir. Is there any basic human right that has at least a near consensus that you can get the blue helmets to go in and actually do something? It's pretty obvious rape camps in South Sudan are not enough. Is there anything, or do you see anything developing where there could actually be real protection by United Nations forces of basic human rights?
Well, when it comes to human, I mean, one thing is, you know, the rights system and what countries can agree on and cannot agree on. When it comes to the implementation mechanism, and we come to the Security Council, I mean, the Security Council is the only body that is empowered to use force against sovereign countries. And that force can be in the form of military actions, or it can be in the form of softer actions like, you know, trade measures and sanctions and stuff like that. And we just live by this simple reality that there are 5 countries on the Security Council that have veto powers. we can have a lot of issue with that fact, but it is a fact. And it could probably be argued that it was unlikely that the Security Council would exist without that fact. I mean, it would probably never have been formed without that fact, but it reflects the realities from 70 years back, not the realities of today. I actually think that there is a very strong agreement on many aspects of human rights, and maybe I would even say most sort of the general aspects. I mean, there is very little disagreement on the right to life. What we see is varying sort of points of departure when it comes to the interplay, because many human rights actually can affect some other human rights. I mean, this classical question. I mean, if we look at well, freedom of expression. I mean, it's a classic thing. Freedom of expression can clash with several other human rights, and we have to find some kind of a balance. So this disagreement between countries is often on sort of this kind of balance. We do not, or I do not detect many countries, I would say, that would have fundamental questions about broad spectrum of the human rights as such, but rather sort of on how to approach them, how to apply them. Having said that, I represent a country that believes very strongly in universality and indivisibility of human rights, and we have to take this discussion with anyone that wants to have that discussion and sort of try to undermine the values that we are fighting for and defending. But I don't think it is helpful when we are doing that to sort of assume that they have some very alien motives. I mean, that's my point. I mean,
of course, the United Nations has instruments, both legal and operational. But the question is that the interference sometimes badly needed now. But to realize now the bureaucracy, the agreements, they're taking too much time. Genocide in Rwanda happened because the United Nations failed to send additional forces there to stop the violences on the early stages. That's why the mechanism exists, but how they work, how they do work. There is the principle of right to protect. There are 3 stages. The first stage is the sovereign country itself. Sovereign country should protect their own people first. Then sovereign country should ask if it's necessary to have external help, either from the international bodies or from international community. So, and then humanitarian intervention takes place. For example, in Libya. But if all these interventions are good, this is the question: what is going on in Libya today? It's a mess. It's a mess. That is why that there are instruments, but a lot of the vacuum, a lot of the gaps to bring assistance in time and to bring peace for a durable period of time. Look what happened in Myanmar. The problem existed 10 years ago. United Nations interfered. And then the United Nations stopped monitoring situation. Reconciliation process failed. Even the democratic government came to the power, so nothing happened. New, old violences are on the ground. Why? Because the major problems, they were not resolved there. So it's a complex approach, and how to use all these instruments. This is the question. Peacekeepers are coming only where there is peace to keep. United Nations does not have mandate for peace enforcement. And this is the problem. Peacekeeping, peace building, it's okay. But only now, so there are debates how to bring this function to one of the major instruments. There are many gaps. We have to understand the mechanism to better implement existing instruments, because you can't use one of the provisions of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights violating other principles. For example, it's well known debate, freedom of expression. Ambassador mentioned it today. French government protected these cartoons magazines who brought the image of Mohammed in a wrong way, and it created a big conflict. So the French government protected the right to freedom of expression. Millions of the Muslims, they went to the streets demanding that their religious rights were violated. So it means that in international relations, in domestic relations, the golden rule should prevail. Do not do to anybody what you do not want to be done towards you. Don't do what you want to be done to yourself. So if you are enjoying one part of your rights, human rights, so and violating the rights of others through the freedom of expression, or not right way of using this freedom of expression. So a lot of the things should be well taken, well understood, and well implemented when we are trying to protect the universality of human rights. Please, your questions? Yeah.
Yeah. So a little bit related to his question, but he was asking about peacekeeping, and you're saying that enforcement of peace is not a mandate, and the bureaucracy works really slowly when you're sending forces on the ground. What about rights that are being violated that don't involve peacekeeping forces? What are the mechanisms? So you're talking about the Rohingya, for example, and the main problem is not or the root of like current problems in the region are that these people were like expelled from citizenship. Their citizenship was revoked, and they were essentially stateless, which is a right that is guaranteed by the Declaration of Human Rights. So what are the mechanisms that the UN can employ, and especially the Third Committee, that don't involve peace? Because this is not an enforcement like a military issue, and this is a recurring problem in refugees and around the world. But with this as an example, like what are the mechanisms that the United Nations is able to employ in ensuring citizenship for people who have been effectively like denationalized?
Well, I think this is a very important point. I mean, what I was referring to earlier when I talked about the soft law nature of the General Assembly. It is clearly so. The General Assembly, its resolutions, they don't have binding effect as such. They are not treaty obligations. You cannot take a country before an international tribunal for not living up to whatever norms have been put in effect by the General Assembly. However, the strength of the General Assembly is exactly that it is different from the Security Council. it's all of the member states. It's not only 15. It's not 5 of them that can stop things with a veto. So at the same time, it is about persuasion. It's not about using brute force. And when it comes to persuasion, and that is sort of what I've been referring to all along, when it comes to persuasion, you have to engage in persuasion. And that's why I'm one of those that are skeptical about the increased willingness to revert to voting. Because when you revert to voting, you may be a little bit sort of accepting that those that will be against you, they simply will continue to be against you. You have given up on trying to convince people. Now, convincing people to do what you want them to do is not an easy task. You have to have a lot of patience. You cannot give up, even though it takes a very long time. But when we compare that to enforcement under authority like the Security Council has, I think the case can be made that it is not so simple to come to the conclusion that enforcement of soft law or normative work necessarily means less results. We have endless examples of enforcement with hard enforcement that has failed as well. So I simply think that we cannot just come to the conclusion that because we don't have enforcement, we cannot affect change. It is clear we have situations, very regrettable situations that will follow us as humanity for a very long time, like the inaction in Rwanda. But it is also clear that today that there are many member states around the world that, for example, believe and cite that as the reason for the reluctance for many things that are happening, that the international community went too far in its reactions to Libya at that time. So it cut both ways. But engaging in this conversation and engaging in trying to persuade someone is actually very important in international work. And if we look at the world today, I've sometimes heard this cynical view. I mean, when I was sent over to New York, one dear friend of mine in a very powerful position in Iceland said to me when he actually congratulated me on being on my way to New York, and I thanked him and said, I look very much forward to going there. And he said, really? In New York, they argue over the same texts year after year, decade after decade, and then they drop a word or add a comma. And I paused and I thought a little bit about it, and I said, after a while, yes. But how would the world look if those diplomats over in New York had not been doing that for the last 70 years? Just think about it. The alternative might not be something that is better. It might actually be something that is much worse. And regardless of the cynicism that we have floating around, we have numerous evidence for huge progress that has been made on so many fields around the world in the last 70 years. So I don't think that we should sort of take that out of the picture. We should never give up fighting the shortcomings, but we should also allow ourselves to actually take some pride and joy in what has been achieved. And there are quite a number of things that have been achieved. Mm-hmm.
Your question is very important because it's about the essence of the United Nations generally. So how the decisions are being taken. As Ambassador said, things are slowly, but they are changing to the positive. if, for example, Security Council, the main body who is adopting the sanctions and sending troops and so on, if for decades Security Council rejected any issues which are not about the peace and security, including human rights. Human rights violation is the basic for many of the conflicts reasons. But Security Council rejected all these things. Only recently we got, recently, I mean, few decades, the human rights of children in armed conflict, women in armed conflict, the human rights are becoming the one of the important issues in the Security Council. So, raising the awareness about the reasons of many conflicts. So we are trying to improve the existing system. There is no other system but what we have. So improvement of the system, this is what exactly is being discussed now, including migration, including climate change. I negotiated bringing into the Security Council the problem of small island countries. They are disappearing. They are losing territories and people. And Security Council kept telling, it's climate change. It's not to us. Go to the other bodies and so on. And then, when the small island countries, they agreed to put the world order in different way. So the challenge to the safety, peace and security for the small island countries because of the climate change. Climate change in the end, not at the beginning. So that's why Security Council has this issue. The problem of migrants, it was a very important resolution in the third committee. Do you know that this is the less protected part of the population in the world? Because refugees, they are well protected by the instruments. Migrants, no. All the refugees are migrants. Not all the migrants are refugees. So today, if you are speaking about Tuvalu, Kiribati, Vanuatu, what to do if we can't stop the raising of the ocean? The only way to evacuate them. To evacuate, you have to give them certain status, not to be stateless, as you mentioned. But do you think that all the countries in the region, big countries, they are so open to host them? No. No. Look at the debates which are going on. So that's why the debates in the third committee on the rights of migrants and so very important, because we are to succeed with the declaration on migrants and the refugees adopted last year. Well, to move and to implement it. So somebody had a question there. Please continue. Any questions? Yeah. Yes, Anna.
So I was wondering how. So right, you have the structure where a country essentially needs to ask for like help from like the Human Rights Council for going to send in if they're going to send people in to deal with the country, or how have you guys been dealing with a country like China that doesn't believe in infringement in the sovereignty of another country, while you're trying to deal with the human rights violations within that country?
Well, I mean, this is clearly at the center of our system today. There is a very strong focus on sovereignty of individual countries. We have seen, of course, you know, there are not so many limitations on the sovereignty. I mean, the most important one is, of course, the Security Council and the powers that the Security Council has. We have more sort of willingness to revert to some kind of international tribunals and court systems, but still at the core of everything is in the international system is the independent sovereign country. And while we build up on that building block, we have to work with that. And of course, that is reflected in most of the work we are doing. Sergeyev mentioned the responsibility to protect at the beginning. no, a little bit earlier, and the responsibility to protect the theory or doctrine came about after what happened in Rwanda. But if you read a little bit up on that doctrine, you actually see that they are very careful in saying this does not constitute a tool to override sovereignty. It is rather seen as a tool to encourage and support the sovereign entities in doing what they need to do. Still today, for example, in the third committee, I think if we go back some 10-15 years, there was a country-specific resolution in the third committee on China, maybe. And it wouldn't surprise me that it would be part. I think the Chinese delegate almost said that he hated country specifics or something to that effect, reflecting their experience with that. So I actually think that this brings about, also the question: how do we deal with countries? How are we going to deal with them down the road? We are not going to dissolve them. We are not going to say it's like a company that is going into bankruptcy and we're just going to break it up and sell off this part and that part, and this is an unviable company. It is not so. Countries are there and we need to continue to work with them. So what we do today has to be done in such a manner that we can still continue to work with them a couple of years down the road. So I think it is important that we bear that in mind. We need to be able, even for those that are temporarily sort of not very popular with the rest of us, we need to be able to engage with them in such a manner that we have a way a little bit further down the road to engage with them in a constructive manner. And basically that means that there are very strong limitations on what we can do with a country that does not want to cooperate with the outer world. And if we look at the experiences where the rest of the world goes in with blazing guns, trying to overcome that, such a situation, it might very well be argued that experiences of that should not make us too eager to do that. Because actually, if you just look at the reality, it has not worked out so well. There is a long way from going in using military power over to let's say peaceful state building afterwards. So if somebody is contemplating of doing that, they should actually be trying to map out the whole way, not just the first steps.
Yes.
I agree that most human rights humanitarian interventions have failed, and often in the case of the United States, it caused a lot more harm than good, especially on the way. That said, the UN, especially the Security Council, have across the board also failed to address ongoing human rights conflicts and violations. Why do you think the negotiations with Path Forward if World 2 has failed so many times?
The negotiations one?
Why do you think negotiation is the way to curb future human rights abuses when it, like human rights interventions, has failed?
You want to start?
Yeah. Basically, any movement, any operation United Nations is providing is based on the invitation of the government. So United Nations can't come to do on its own anywhere. Invitation should come. The problem is that who is inviting? If the government itself is violator. So in Africa, we had many of the facts on that. On one hand, we have good successes like Liberia. peacekeeping operations, then peace building process brought to good success, a successful story, because the ownership is very important, that the civil society in that country, they took this ownership for reconciliation and building sustainable peace there. All the factors should work. Myanmar is different. So they also moved through the crisis. The democratic government was elected, but reconciliation process was not perfectly finished. And that's why the problem came back. And so we have thousands and thousands of migrants. In protecting of human rights, several factors should work. Several factors: monitoring, detecting, raising the awareness globally, regionally. The role of regional organizations are very important. So for me, it is strange that the countries where democracy is well recognized, like Singapore, like Philippines, most probably India, the neighbors, why they are not so vocal as to the human rights violations in Myanmar. Their role as the regional actors could be absolutely important there. So the protection of human rights, this is not the one instrument solution. Many factors should work, including sanctions. Sanctions, unfortunately, they are coming when the military conflict starts and the bringing the victims, casualties. Look at the Syria. So the first violations were detected when 3 of protesters were killed. Then dozens of them were killed. Then hundreds of them were killed. Thousands started to be killed. Only at that stage, the Security Council started to take making some steps. Of course, as it was said today, that the first responsibility to protect their own people and their rights belongs to the government, to sovereign government. But it is not the case of the government of Assad. So the interests of different global players conflicted there. Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. So that's why the process was not so easy to launch and to move ahead. I agree with the fact that sometimes we have to recognize more the differences than to find the way how to communicate. The question is, for example, Iran is in a specific resolution being criticized for different things, for tortures, for punishments, and the problem not only that they are exercising the capital punishment. Capital punishment is being exercised in the United States and many other countries. How it is being exercised? They are bringing people, making them suffering because of unacceptable way of punishment, throwing the stones, and so on. They are defending their tradition. It's our tradition. We are telling them, guys, we can recognize the cultural relativity, but not moral relativity. No moral relativity when it is about the human dignity and the ways of treating people. So we have to understand this thing that there are limits when people can't be silent. Yes, okay, you have your tradition, but what you're doing. And this is about the third committee, who is bringing this specific country resolution, not to blame Iran for cultural diversity, but to demonstrate that what they are doing is not the 21st century of behavior. So these are the only mechanism United Nations can produce until the other instruments or the concert of instruments to be implemented simultaneously. Well,
and I mean,
you know.
let's not forget that actually this kind of work has had great effect around the world. It's not so that all countries have had the same idea at the same time. I mean, let's just take one simple issue, gender equality. If you see gender equality, which we still have a long way to go, but we have seen a lot happen in the last 100 years or so. It was not so that this idea just spread, rose simultaneously in all these places around the world. It is a classic example of something that has been passed on from country to country through civil society, bottom up, also by actions by the international community. It is a classic example that even though we have a lot of shortcomings all around the world, not only in some countries that we think of as being less progressive when it comes to human rights than others, I want to stress that, all around the world. My country has been ranked on the top on the Gender Equality Index now for 9 years in a row, and it's fuming in Iceland on the Me Too discussion on the social media, not any less than in any other country. But I think it just shows the power of persuasion. You actually, I want people to recognize that it is actually worth it, even though it seems to be a slow process, drawn out, and sometimes you hit obstacles that may make you a little bit cynical. And my only thing is to point out that even though we have the shortcomings of going through these issues through persuasion of words, it can actually a very strong case can be made that this is a very powerful way in the end, even though you lack some of the elements of sort of as someone would say it undiplomatically beating someone to obedience. It is not always about beating someone to obedience. Sometimes you have to persuade someone to sort of falling in line or seeing the sensibility of what you are trying to sell them.
Yes, final.
Thank you
Yes,
for
Maria.
a very informative and interesting presentation. My question relates to basically our expanding notion of human rights in light of technological developments. For instance, how drones or perhaps genetic engineering of humans in the future in light of like CRISPR-Cas9 technology can basically change our conception of what human rights are, and whether this will lead to a turn or a shift of the UN attention to human rights within developed countries.
I don't think that this is an undertaking that will ever be sort of completed. So in that sense, you are absolutely right. As society evolves, as technology evolves, we will have new challenges for human rights, and we will probably have to evolve new frontiers when it comes to the normative side of the work. And you have to forgive me my ignorance again. Like I said, I did not read through all of the documents that passed through my hands this fall. But I don't recall sort of off the cuff that we have seen a lot of these issues in the third committee. But I remember some years back some work taking place in the GA, for example, on drones and artificial intelligence in military action.
Yes, it's true. It is true. So even in the third committee, it is about ethics. It's about ethics in science and technologies, and particularly with artificial intelligence. When It is in the first committee, disarmament committee,
Yeah,
because
yes,
because so sophisticated weaponry being based on the artificial intelligence created when the humankind will not be able to control it, control the processes. So it should be in the agenda. It should be an agenda of different bodies of United Nations, and of course, as far as human rights, it is about ethics. It's about ethics. Thank you. So I guess that a glass of wine is served outside. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.